Hi.
Thanks for coming.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Thank you. It's a niche market. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. So I'll do a little bit of comedy for you. It's a small group here, but hopefully you'll make up in quality what you lack in quantity. Yes, sir.
Would you give us your name again?
Yoram Bauman. Y-O-R-A-M. Last name Bauman, B-A-U-M-A-N.
Thank you.
I'll put it on the screen at some point here, too. So I'm going to do some comedy, and then we'll talk about this carbon tax effort that I'm part of, which is a group called Carbon Washington that's looking to put something on the ballot in November of 2016. So we'd love to get your involvement in that and your support. But let's start with some comedy. So people are surprised about that I make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics, as if it's not the most natural thing in the whole world. But that is what I do. I'll give you an example with this piece here. This is a piece that's called Hyperinflation in Hell. So this is, the economics of the world as we know it is something that's familiar to many people, but the economics of the afterworld is a new topic for economic research. My co-author and I have broken the code, though. So let's actually start with hyperinflation on Earth. This is, something that many people are familiar with. And
It's back.
It's back.
let's try this. This might just be a jinx day overall.
No signal. Got a picture now.
Okay.
Need a password to get into hell, just say Cheney.
Yeah.
All right. Great. So, hyperinflation on Earth.
Lost it again. It doesn't like something on that. And back again.
Try the other keys now. The other keys works better. Sorry, this is really unprofessional.
You're an economist.
I am an economist.
Yeah.
I'll say that it's been a big couple of years for stand-up comedy about economics.
Yes.
A couple years ago, I got to be on the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Yeah, now, I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy, but let me just tell you this. In the world of stand-up comedy, ladies and gentlemen, it does not get any bigger than the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. It was actually pretty amazing. They interviewed 3 economists on this show. They interviewed Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize. And they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. I was just up in Alaska and I did that joke and they loved it. All right, let's see if this works. I don't know. We'll find out.
But you have a brain.
Yeah. And what did they ask me? My moment of TV fame in the PBS NewsHour, they asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage. All right, now a couple things about this. All right, first of all, I am not afraid of failure. All right, I'm an economist. Second, I'm a professional comedian. Right, so if a joke doesn't work, you just sort of keep throwing stuff out there until you find something that sticks. Which is basically the same thing that the Fed and the Treasury did for the last 6 or 7 years. And finally, I had to admit, on the PBS NewsHour, that in fact I had bombed on stage. The worst show I ever did was in October of 2008. You remember what was happening to the world economy and the stock markets? October 2008, it looked like we were going back into the Great Depression, right? October of 2008, I did a show in Colorado Springs for a group of bankers. And they were not happy campers. And comedy is kind of a violent business, right? Like if you're doing well, then you're killing. If you're doing badly, then you're bombing. And And I totally bombed that show, and I actually did so poorly, I spent a fair amount of time afterwards sort of soul searching, like trying to figure out where had I lost the connection with this audience of bankers in Colorado Springs in October of 2008. And I finally realized that I lost them on my opening line. And my opening line was, "Hey, how's it going?" Let's see if this is going any better.
It might pop up.
There it comes.
All right. Well, anyway, here's Zimbabwe between the world, or Germany between the world wars. Zimbabwe in 2008 had this massive bout of hyperinflation.
Yeah.
Right, this is the $100 trillion Zimbabwe note that you can buy on eBay for about 25 cents. Now the economics of the afterworld is sort of different, right? Like the conventional wisdom is that the economy of the afterworld is extremely stable. We actually show to the contrary that in fact there is chronic hyperinflation in the afterworld, and that is driven by the same thing that drives hyperinflation here on Earth, namely a massive increase in the money supply. Now what is driving this increase in the money supply is Jaws paper. Here are some examples of Jaws paper. Maybe, is it possible to turn this light off?
Yeah.
If not, this is going to have better, I think, image quality than this. It's a little better. So here are some examples of Jaws paper. Jaws paper is part of certain Asian religious traditions where you burn fake money in order to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. So the basic premise of our paper is population growth in Asia, economic growth in Asia, more people burning more money to send to their ancestors in the afterworld. What is this doing to the monetary base of the afterworld? A phenomenon that has been exacerbated by a recent technological development, which I'm going to show you in this video here, that's also sort of going to explain, get it to work, it's going to explain how Jaws paper works. So here's the old way to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. You get this money, you fake money, you burn it, and the money goes to your ancestors in the afterworld. Now here's the new way to send money to your ancestors in the afterworld. This is the Hell Banking app for the iPhone. It's been downloaded 10,000 times, including by me. It's like the dematerialization of dematerialization.
Right.
Yeah.
And in kind of this very scary twist, not only can you send fake money to your ancestors in the afterworld with this app, you can send them on iPhones, which are presumably loaded with the app, right? So it's very positive feedback. Skip the literature review. We'll go to the theory, right? It sounds great that, like, you know, that everybody can print as much money as they want for their ancestors in the afterworld. It's kind of like everybody gets to be a central banker, right? Like, what could be wrong with that? But if you think about it for a minute, you realize it's kind of not as great as it sounds. You end up with this tragedy of the commons situation where each individual is going to print more money for their ancestors in the afterworld than is socially optimal. Like, imagine, for example, what happened in the United States if everybody could print $100 bills, right? Instead of just the U.S. Treasury and the North Koreans. So that's the theory. The empirics, you may think it's impossible to do empirical work on the afterworld, but in fact we've surmounted that challenge. I'll give you an example of how we do this. It's using an economic theory that's called rational expectations. You can basically think of it as arbitrage, though. So these three pieces of Jaws paper, $1 million, £1 million, and €500, were all purchased by me in Beijing for the same amount of money here on Earth. Right? The idea is that they should be worth the same amount of money in the afterworld, because otherwise, why would somebody buy the one that had lower value? And so that's the arbitrage, rational expectations kind of idea. Now, none of that tells us what any of these three pieces of Jaws paper are actually worth. So that's where this next piece of evidence comes from. These three pieces of Jaws paper, $50, $100, $1,000 Jaws paper notes, all in the same currency, right? All purchased by me in Beijing for the same amount of money here on Earth. They should be worth the same amount of money in the afterworld. In other words, we are looking for the variable x that solves the equation 50x equals 100x equals 1000x. Now I'm going to put the details in the mathematical appendix and cut to the punchline, which is that x has got to be equal to 0. Now this actually informs our policy recommendations. We think that there is an immediate and pressing need for necroeconomic reform. Because if we don't have necroeconomic reform, then terrible things will happen to non-living standards. You know how to measure non-living standards, right? The real GDP per capita. Anyway, there's three levels of necroeconomic reform. Level 1 is the faithful should learn some economics. And unfortunately, education alone is usually not sufficient to solve the tragedy of the commons. So level 2 is that the Fed and other central banks could take over the underworld. Right? They have swollen balance sheets, they could swallow them a little bit more. And level 3, if that doesn't work, is dollarization. In other words, we could ban Joss paper and require people who want to send money to their ancestors in the afterworld to burn actual currency, which we're confident will solve the problem of hyperinflation in the afterworld, as well as it has worked in places like Zimbabwe and Ecuador that now use the US dollar as their currency. I have a little epilogue to this paper, which is that my colleague and I actually submitted this paper to a real economics journal. It's called Economic Inquiry, and we submitted it there because this journal has a humor section. I know this because I'm the editor of the humor section. But I made a classic mistake. Instead of just saying, I'm the editor of this paper and I accept my own paper, I said, well, I'm going to recuse myself in the process and ask the editor-in-chief to shepherd the paper through the referee process, which he did by sending it to 2 referees who had no sense of humor. Referee number 1 wrote that the paper is funny as long as you are constrained to reading economics articles. Kind of damning with faint praise, I think. Referee number 2 wrote something even more bizarre. Referee number 2 wrote the paper is entertaining in the sense that a stand-up comedy routine is entertaining. You'd think it would be pretty entertaining, right? So the paper was rejected, which I'm still bitter about, so partly I'm sharing this with you as my catharsis. So the reasons for rejections, referee number 1 wrote that the paper lacked a dynamic postmortem general equilibrium model, without which it couldn't be published. Referee number 2 wrote something that still blows my mind. Referee number 2 wrote, the paper makes the mistaken assumption that there is no technological progress in the afterlife. Why would the dead suddenly lose their ability to innovate? I don't know, maybe it's because they're dead. Referee number 2 also added a PS, where is the promised mathematical appendix? It takes all kinds. I guess before we go any further, I'll show you my t-shirt. This is my my Enjoy Capitalism t-shirt.
No brothers about that.
Shirt was made in China.
Right.
If you look on the tag on the back, it's actually made out of 80% cotton and 20% irony. Dry, clean only.
Right.
I did live in China for 5 months. I work on climate change issues, so I figured if I was going to work on climate change, I should try to learn something about China. So I finagled a position at a Chinese university. This is a view from my apartment complex window. I lived in a housing complex in Beijing that houses 400,000 people.
Oh my God. 400,000.
And I was one of 2 non-Chinese people who lived there. It was me and a guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy. And then one day I was walking down the street to the bus stop. Hello, come on in. And I saw a black guy. And I kind of lost my sense of propriety a little bit. Like I walked up to him and I looked at him a little bit, and finally I said, excuse me, I said, you must be the... But before I could get the words out, he pointed at me. And he said, excuse me, he said, you must be the white guy. Sure enough, I was the white guy, he was the black guy. And there was everybody else in Beijing. He was a super nice guy. He was there from Ghana. He was on a scholarship. We went to McDonald's. We had lunch. International sign of friendship. Anyway, this is the view from my apartment window. About 5% of the time it looked like this. Much more often the view from my apartment window looked like that. In the middle of the day. So these pollution problems, like local air pollution problem, was not the same thing as climate change, but they tend to be correlated. I think they're both related to burning fossil fuels. So I'm going to transition here. I'll still tell you a couple more jokes, but I'm going to move on to the more serious part of what I'm here to chat with you all about, right? So, like I said, I make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics. Mostly I do colleges and corporate events, and the corporate events tend to be, Florida Bankers Association, Barry Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, like places like this. So they tend to be fairly conservative. And I'm going to give you the same little climate pitch I give them. It starts out with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere going up. Nobody really doubts that this is primarily caused by human activity, right? Burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. So this theory actually predates Al Gore.
Yeah.
They laughed at that joke more in Texas. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who's a chemist in Sweden, and in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of in the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden.
Yeah.
And we tend to be a little more concerned about changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years for global average temperatures. The red bars are 10-year average temperatures from the 1880s up to the 1970s. And then the 1980s, there's the 1990s, the 2000s. For what it's worth, the first few years of this decade. Temperatures going up, I would argue, pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Now, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Right? Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation, development of new technologies, all the things that I, at least, as an economist, love about capitalism. And so what I work on as an economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. You may like capitalism, you may not like capitalism, but we can all agree that it's a very powerful force. So what our campaign is about is using that powerful force to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. Now this is generally the part in my talk where people stop laughing. Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this. But there is a side benefit to these policies, other than the main benefit of, potentially saving the world. Right? And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. The idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So what's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting or revenue neutral tax swaps. Right? The idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like pollution, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. And this is where I find common ground, even with folks like George Will, columnist for the Washington Post, pretty conservative fellow. He came to one of my classes a few years ago. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax.
Yeah.
Right, and with unemployment at the time was 8%, I still think it's too high. I hate the payroll tax, right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. Anyway, economists across the political spectrum think this is a pretty good idea, and there's even a place that's done this. So in the eyes of many economists, the best climate policy in the world, not too far north from where you are here, Canadian province of British Columbia, actually had a right-of-center government that said, look, we want to do something about climate change, we want to be market-friendly, we don't want to grow government. So they implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Right? So all the money from the carbon tax, in fact a little more than all the money from the carbon tax, goes to reduce personal and corporate income taxes. There's a big offset for low-income households. So yes, folks in BC pay 30 cents a gallon more for gasoline, but they also have the lowest personal income taxes in Canada, the lowest corporate income taxes in the G8 group of rich democracies. That policy has been in place since 2008. Now supported by both major parties up there, and we can actually see how it's been working. So here's sales of petroleum products. BC is in green, Canada as a whole is in blue. You can see that carbon emissions in BC have fallen maybe 10 or 15%, both in absolute terms and relative to Canada as a whole. So my total for the slide is economics works. If you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. We can look at the economy of BC, which is doing fine. Right? So really a terrific success story, I would argue, in terms of environmental policy. So inflation is low. So I'm part of this group called Carbon Washington, and I'll transition to some other slides about our campaign. But we're looking at bringing a BC-style carbon tax to Washington State, and I'm here to ask for your support. So the basic premise of our policy is a revenue-neutral BC-style approach, because we're trying to do something that's bipartisan. And there's no income tax in Washington State, as you know, but the big tax is the sales tax. So the idea is the tax is $25 per ton of CO2. So that's not nothing. That's 25 cents a gallon of gasoline, approximately. But we're going to use the revenue to cut the sales tax by a full percentage point. So in very broad strokes, most households will pay a couple $100s a year more for fossil fuels and a couple $100s a year less for everything else. We're also going to fund something called the Working Families Rebate, which is an earned income tax credit benefit for low-income households. It's actually on the books in Washington State. It's never been funded. It'll provide up to $1,500 a year for 400,000 working families in Washington State. Huge benefit. And we're going to effectively eliminate the B&O tax, the business tax for manufacturing in the state of Washington as a way to address impacts on energy-intensive, trade-exposed businesses. So that's the campaign. I'll tell you a couple more jokes, and then we'll go into more detail on the campaign. I'd love to get your feedback and your involvement. So I made fun of the right, so I'll make fun of the left a little bit. This sign, Obama equals Keynesian, question mark. Keynesian economics is, as you may know, going back to the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who argued that we could use fiscal or monetary policy to bring the economy out of a recession. So there was a right-winger who showed up at a left-wing rally in Washington, D.C. with this sign, Obama equals Keynesian, question mark. And they took videos of all these left-wing activists coming up to them, and they were really mad. And they said, you know, that is ridiculous. You know, his birth certificate is on file. I don't know why. He is not Kenyan. Another fine piece of economics humor. This is a real economics paper. It's called Can Financial Innovation Help to Explain the Reduced Volatility of Economic Activity? A paper that was published in 2006, shortly before financial innovation led to the greatest increase in the volatility of economic activity since the Great Depression.
Yeah.
You may think this bodes ill for the research that was done by these scholars, but in fact, it's okay. I have tracked down the abstract of this paper, and here's the abstract of this paper. No. I have a couple of cartoon economics books. I brought some copies if anybody's interested in buying them. They're $20, or you can get them at your bookstore or Amazon or whatever. And then my newest book is called A Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change. All these books are super fun, so I hope you'll check them out. That's how to get a hold of me. That's Carbon Washington. And let me transition to this other little deck I have and talk about the campaign a little bit. If that's all. So we actually have we filed a ballot measure, so we're running what's called an initiative to the legislature. So we've filed a ballot measure, and it's initiative 732 to the legislature. And like I said, it's kind of based on this BC experience, so I just showed you these slides. So I'll show you again. Here's BC, they reduced emissions, their economy is doing fine. You know, as you know, there's a lot of talk about climate policy in Washington State right now. I will give you the joke version of my story about carbon taxes versus cap and trade systems, which are both ways to put a price on carbon. So to some extent, you know, the policies, those two policies are a lot more alike than they are different. But I do have a preference for the carbon tax approach, and it comes down a lot to being simple and transparent and clean. And I'll give you my story about why that is by comparing BC, which has a carbon tax, to California, which has a cap and trade system. The BC carbon tax is actually so simple you can explain it in a haiku. So I'm very proud of this haiku. So here's the haiku. It's fossil CO2, $30 for each ton, revenue neutral. Lovely. California has a cap and trade system, which is a little bit more like war and peace. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, right? War and Peace is generally recognized as one of the best novels ever written, but it's certainly more complicated. So Carbon Washington is looking to bring a BC-style carbon tax to Washington State. A little bit about the political context. So as many of you know, Governor Inslee has introduced the climate bill in the legislature. It's sort of facing it's an uphill battle, right? But we're positioning ourselves as being the relief pitcher. So we're not in competition with the governor's policy. We're not opposing the governor's policy. We're the relief pitcher, and it turns out now that the baseball season has started that only 2% of starting pitchers actually make it all the way through the game. So we're doing this relief pitcher thing. And it actually, there was an article that just came out a couple days ago that argued that we're actually benefiting the governor's policy. So this article here, carbon tax rising from the ashes in Olympia, on the prospect. Starts out, it seemed dead, but Governor Inslee's proposed tax on carbon polluters could still come back to life this legislative session. And the argument was the proposal stalled, as you know. Legislators have looked at signature gathering by the group Carbon Washington to put Initiative 732 on the ballot. The prospect of a blunt initiative rather than a more nuanced bill has prompted legislators to huddle about Inslee's carbon emission tax proposal, said Joe Fitzgibbon, who's the Democrat who's helping push the climate bill through the legislature. So we really think that there's a case to be made that our effort is actually helping potentially push the governor's bill through the legislature. So our strategy, we're filing what's called an initiative to the legislature. That means we filed that in about a month ago. We have between now and the end of the year to collect 315,000 signatures. And then the way initiatives to the legislature works are it goes to the legislature in January 2016. They either pass it, in which case it becomes law, or it goes on the ballot in November 2016. So that's the way it works. And we've raised $100,000. We've hired campaign co-directors. We've hired some field staff, including a fellow up in Bellingham. I take it back. We're working on hiring somebody in Bellingham. We've almost announced it. And so we're doing good work. And I'll tell you what the proposal was since we filed with the Secretary of State. Here's what the ballot measure actually says. It says Initiative Measure 732 concerns taxes. This measure would impose a carbon emission tax on certain fossil fuels and fossil fuel generating electricity, reduce the sales tax by 1 percentage point and increase a low income exemption, and reduce certain manufacturing taxes, should this measure be enacted into law. So that's what we're looking to put on the ballot. And we're looking for your help to get it there. So there's the policy again. It's carbon tax, $15 in the first year, going up to $25, and then increasing slowly after that to maintain revenue neutrality. Cut the sales tax by a half point the first year, a full point in the second year. Fund the working families rebate. Had a 25% bump up of the federal earned income tax credit, and effectively eliminate the business tax for manufacturers in the state. There are a couple of phase-ins. It covers basically all fossil fuels that are burned in the state, plus imported electricity. There are a couple of phase-ins for agricultural diesel, for on-farm diesel, and for public transportation fuels. The carbon tax on those phases in slowly over 40 years. But otherwise, it's a pretty simple policy. If you're interested in seeing the impacts on your own household, we actually worked with the University of Washington folks in the computer science department on a tax swap calculator. So you actually go to this website, carbon.cs.washington.edu, and you say, this is how much I earn, how much my household earns for the year. It estimates your sales tax savings, and then you say how much do you drive and how much do you fly and what's your zip code and how's your home heated, and it estimates your home energy use, and it tells you what your expected carbon tax liabilities are. There's a business calculator that's part of this too, so super neat tool. Like I said, most households end up paying a few $100s a year more for fossil fuels and a few $100s a year less for everything else. So in aggregate, it basically balances for households, which is what we're looking for. I do think we have some bipartisan